It's a feeling that's flowing like a river. Time to swap them dollar signs for dreams. There's a river running through it and it flows through you and me.
Welcome to Water Planet News. I'm John Osborne, broadcasting from Spokane, Washington. Today we're going to be focusing on two really important stories, and I hope you watch them both. These stories are told by two remarkable women, Sam Mace of Save Our Wild Salmon, and Patty Martin, who's the former mayor of Quincy, Washington. In the autumn of 1805, Lewis and Clark canoed down the Snake River to its confluence with the Columbia. There they found abundant runs of salmon and Indian nations that lived with the river. In about 200 years, the blink of an eye, profound changes have occurred to this river. In part, the consequence includes potential extinction for the salmon of the Snake River. Efforts are underway. Let's turn now to the story about these salmon and Oregon Governor Kitzhaber's efforts to bring people together to find a solution. Here to tell us that story is Sam Mace, Save Our Wild Salmon.
My name is Sam Mace, and I'm with the Save Our Wild Salmon Coalition, which is a group of organizations that include commercial fishermen, sport fishing businesses and groups, and conservation organizations working to restore wild salmon to the Columbia Basin. Historically, up to 30 million wild salmon and steelhead entered the Columbia River, the mouth of the Columbia River, every year. Before Lewis and Clark arrived. And in the course of the centuries of development here in the West, we've seen the numbers of wild salmon and steelhead plummet to 1 to 2% of those historic numbers. And in addition to development and grazing and logging and overfishing at the turn of the century, the primary reason, one of the main reasons why we have seen this steady decline in our wild salmon is because of the number of large dams we've built up both the Columbia River and the lower Snake River. And our coalition specifically has focused on the Snake River system in the last couple decades because the Snake River Basin of Idaho, Northeast Oregon, Southeast Washington holds the biggest piece of intact salmon habitat left in the lower 48. But we have this problem of the salmon being able to make it up to those streams, and the young salmon that are born in those rivers up in Idaho in the Snake River Basin making it downstream to come back and replenish the populations. And the main reason is because of these dams we've built, and in particular these 4 deadly dams on the lower Snake River that have been the death knell to our wild salmon here in the inland Northwest. So our coalition has been working to look at ways that we can remove the 4 lower Snake River dams and replace the small amount of energy, the transportation, and other benefits that those dams provide with better, affordable, and clean energy alternatives. So we've been working with farmers, we've been working with energy users, we've been working with local communities to have that conversation about how we can restore our salmon, restore the lower Snake River, and make sure that those stakeholders are taken care of as well. We've been pushing our elected leaders here in the region for a long time to get us past this impasse that we've had as salmon plan after salmon plan has been ruled illegal in the courts, and we just continue to see our wild salmon decline. And making sure that we get a legal salmon plan is really important, and that court fight remains important, but at the same time we need to start bringing all the stakeholders together to look at our long-term solutions of how we can restore these salmon and how we can find other ways of meeting our transportation and energy needs. And we were really encouraged to see Governor Kitzhaber of Oregon come out and support a stakeholder process to bring everyone together in the region and have a conversation about how we can solve this crisis. And, we want to see and hope that dam removal is one of those options that's looked at. Certainly other options will be on the table as well. but we feel confident that we can, if we come together with the objective economics and looking at the science, find a path forward that restores our river and our wild salmon. This issue goes beyond just restoring our wild salmon, which certainly is the biggest question and biggest crisis point that such a process needs to address. But at the same time, we have these larger issues that are wrapped up in the future of the Lower Snake River and the future of those 4 dams that go beyond salmon. They're about economic development in riverside towns like Lewiston, that are about how do we address and pay for aging infrastructure, and how do we maintain and find the money in this day and age with shrinking budgets to maintain this dam system and keep both the public safe, our communities safe, and our fish and wildlife safe. And one of the pieces, as an example, that's becoming abundantly clear is that we're not going to have the money to take care of all the hydro system, all the dams, all the locks, all the barge systems across the country. And we need to start looking at which ones do we need and should be part of a modern economy, and which are just outdated technology, frankly, and that it would be in our best interest, as well as the best interest of the salmon, to find a way to decommission and remove. And the 4 Lower Snake River dams are prime candidates for that. They're aging dams, they're coming to the end of their lifespan, there's sediment problems that are creating flood risks for Lewiston, and it's a navigation system of allowing barges to go down the river that's becoming very outdated. We're already seeing farmers in the region switching to rail, switching to truck, because it's far more competitive, more efficient, and can be more affordable. So these are some of the larger questions that we want to see a process convened in the region address, because they're very important to our communities here. And if we're going to save the salmon, we have to address these other issues as well. It's a really important time if you care about salmon and steelhead, if you care about the future of towns like Lewiston, to stand up and talk to your elected leaders about this. We really need citizens talking to Governor Kitzhaber's fellow elected leaders in the region, the Governor of Washington, Senator Murray, Senator Cantwell, and other elected officials in the region, to encourage them to support a stakeholder process, and one that is science-driven, that is transparent, and that has all options on the table, including dam removal. And we really hope that in 2013, whatever next presidential administration there is, and the elected officials here in the region can come together and make that go forward and support Kitzhaber in his call. Again, this isn't just about the very important biological values and cultural values that these wild and salmon steelhead have for us here in the region and for the tribes, but it is really an issue of economics and jobs. We have a lot of communities and towns from Idaho to Astoria that depend on salmon and steelhead for jobs in their local economies, whether it be commercial fishing or recreational fishing. And these are important jobs culturally, important to these communities financially, and we think that there's a path forward where we can have wheat and wild salmon on our plate into the future, that we can have farming here, but we can also make room for salmon and the jobs that the salmon provide.
Thank you, Sam. To learn more about Save Our Wild Salmon, visit their website or contact Sam Mace directly. Water Planet News has invited Patty Martin, the former mayor of Quincy, Washington, to talk to us about the 6 new major data centers that have located to Quincy, Washington. This is the subject of a recent New York Times article. In September of 2011, Patty and I toured Quincy, and then after the New York Times article, we sat down to do this interview. These data centers are important. They represent a major footprint on the Columbia River Dam and hydropower generation system. They also represent a large demand on the community's groundwater, as well as raising public health concerns because of the large number of these diesel engines located in the community. Here to tell this story is Patty Martin.
Hey, my name's Patty Martin. I'm the former mayor of a small agricultural community in Washington State called Quincy. So Quincy is located in the heart of the Columbia Basin and as an agricultural community is low to moderate income and a population that is 74% Hispanic. Because of our cheap water and cheap electricity, Quincy has become a target for the siting of data centers. Most people think of these as the cloud. These are huge facilities. Microsoft's, for example, takes up 500,000 square feet, 70 acres, and to store the electronic data that people use on a routine basis to run their iPhones and websites and to play games against each other. Right now we are at 6 data centers with large capacity diesel generators to provide backup power if we should ever have a power outage. And at this point in time, we are permitted for 158 locomotive-sized diesel generators, only 17 of which will have pollution control devices on these engines. Yeah, the concern is just the sheer number of these locomotive-sized generators within less than 2 square miles and the amount of diesel particulate matter. Diesel particulate is 7.5 times more toxic than all 188 of the regulated hazardous air pollutants. 7 times more toxic than the combined toxicity of all of those hazardous air pollutants. Additionally, the data centers use huge amounts of electricity. Between the 6 data centers in Quincy, I believe that the combined electrical power is enough to serve a community of over 400,000 people. So there's a huge heat dissipation issue with these data centers, and they require huge amounts of volume or huge amounts of water to cool them. So for example, each of the data centers withdraws from our aquifer about 500,000 gallons of water each day just to cool the towers. And so between the electrical demand, the water usage, and then the air pollution, the environmental impact of these facilities, especially on a small town like Quincy, is overwhelming.
When you've raised concerns with Microsoft and others, what's been the response?
Well, I'm not sure that we actually got to raise concerns with them. We asked a lot of questions when they were first, in the case of Microsoft and Yahoo, they were expanding. So they were adding to an existing facility. And when we started asking questions of the state wouldn't provide us with any information. What they instead required us to do was to raise our questions during the public comment period, and then they would provide answers to us. And so ultimately what we ended up doing was filing appeals on each one of the permits. There is an army of attorneys for each of the industries, and then there is the army of attorneys that represent the Department of Ecology, and we're up against both of those entities, and obviously outmatched. We got involved in this in August of 2010, and with the exception of probably 6 weeks out of that entire time, we have been under motions for summary judgment, or we have been filing appeals, or we have been under motions in limine. We've been preparing for hearing, multiple motions for summary judgment from a number of these attorneys. They've done everything they can to just keep us bombarded with legal work when we're not attorneys. So there's been a huge learning curve to come up to speed on the Clean Air Act and the state's Clean Air Act. In the case of Quincy, what it appears that the state did was in 2009, they gutted the state's clean air rules so that a certain standard called TBAC, or Best Available Control Technology for Toxic Air Pollutants, which is the state's more stringent air quality standards, they gutted those rules so that they applied a lesser standard as these facilities were coming into Quincy. And in lieu of applying this more stringent standard, instead what they did for Quincy was they established a goal of 100 cancers per million, that they would allow the cancer from diesel particulate matter, again, that very, very toxic air pollutant, they would allow it to rise as high as 100 cancers per million before they would require any mitigation or offsets. In 2007 or 2008, the legislature passed their first tax incentive. And at that time, I know that Microsoft saved about $100 million in taxes. Then the legislature was approached in 2010, again to extend the tax credits, but this time to only if data centers sited within an urban growth area, within a community. And this was presented by the Quincy Port District. And I suspect at that time, Quincy was probably one of the few areas that actually was willing to accept these huge facilities with all of these generators inside of their urban growth areas. So each one of these facilities received a tax credit to site there. And in exchange, all they had to do was create 35 jobs. There was no explicit requirement that they had to put on pollution control devices. So these companies saved hundreds of millions of dollars, and the cost for controls is probably less than $2 million on each of these facilities. And some of the wealthiest companies in the world are in Quincy without putting controls, again, pollution control devices like diesel particulate filters or diesel oxidation catalysts or ammonia scrubbers on their engines. The 2010 tax incentive had tied to it that each one of these facilities had to create at least 35 jobs. Okay, we're talking 35 jobs in exchange for hundreds of millions of dollars in tax incentives. That was the trade-off. We get the pollution, they get the $100 million tax incentives, we get 35 jobs. These generators, these engines have to be run monthly. And because there's so many of them, once they're all installed, there will either be 5 running every day of the week if they're run 7 days of the week, or there'll be 7 run every day of the week if they're run 5 days a week. But that's for perpetuity. That's until these facilities change over to some other backup power. But we had all been misled because the engines are also run when they take some of the computers offline. Just like you would de-energize, you would unplug your computer if you were servicing it. It's the same thing with Microsoft. They de-energize. They unplug themselves from the power grid and they run their backup generators if they're going to service certain parts of their facility. I think one thing that everybody can do is be as responsible, we talked about this before, be as responsible with their electronic waste. I mean, if you are done with your emails and you don't need to keep them, get rid of them. There's according to the New York Times, there's over 3 million of these facilities worldwide, and they're only operating at like 10% capacity. If they don't, need more capacity, they aren't going to build more of these facilities. So delete the information you're not using so that there doesn't have to be, an increased construction of facilities like this. So we can all be responsible in that way. The Department of Ecology could enforce and have the laws properly implemented. Again, they changed rules that were in place. In fact, I would argue and have continued to argue that those same rules are currently in effect because they were adopted under our federal state implementation plan, federally enforceable, can't be changed on the whim of the Department of Ecology. So I would want the Department of Ecology to properly implement the laws. As far as the legislature goes, insist that these tax dollars, that a portion of these tax dollars that were saved by these industries be used to put on controls.
Thanks, Patty. I just want to take this moment to honor your work and the work of others in your community. Standing up to protect your community is difficult, and especially when you're challenging large companies, some of the wealthiest in the world, as well as Washington state government, which has a repeated pattern, especially in eastern Washington, of supporting corporate and institutional interests over the public interest. For more about this story, you can read the New York Times article by James Glantz, The Cloud Factories, or visit the Sierra Club website for the Upper Columbia River Group and click on Quincy Data Centers. It's the largest all-federal irrigation system and how that system is threatening the survival of salmon. If we go back about 200 years, really the blink of an eye in time. On August 12th of 1805, the Lewis and Clark expedition stepped from the Missouri River watershed into the Columbia River watershed. And with those steps, it entered a river of life, a place where 15 million to maybe 50 million salmon returned each year to spawn and renew a cycle of life. In a very short period of time, 200 years, profound changes have come to this river, and a number of runs of salmon have been forced into extinction. Part of the problem has been loss of habitat. Other problems include the construction of large dams. Perhaps the largest of the dams, and the one that comes to most people's mind, is Grand Coulee Dam. Grand Coulee Dam was largely a personal decision by President Roosevelt in the 1930s. There were choices made available to him, and he elected to build the big dam, the high dam, in part to make it an irrigation project. It was the Depression, and there were Depression-era farmers that he was hoping to help. The dam was constructed. It blocked just incredible runs of salmon up into the upper Columbia and into Canada. And the consequences for the river have been profound, even as the dam itself has produced great benefits in terms of hydropower and flood control. But we continue to live with the environmental legacy and the impacts that it has had on native cultures in the Columbia River system. It's been clear as time has progressed that the remaining runs of salmon are in trouble. And as river flows continue to be impacted by withdrawals, in part for irrigated agriculture, and as we face a time of climate change, those salmon are in more jeopardy with each passing year. Washington State has been no friend of salmon, and that has been particularly true in recent decades. Still today, the state is pressing ahead to withdraw large amounts of water from the river, even in the face of recommendations from the National Academies of Science in 2004. Shortly thereafter, Washington State passed a law to aggressively pursue new opportunities to build new dams and to take more water from the Columbia River. Part of the impetus behind the dam building frenzy in eastern Washington is a problem on the Columbia Plateau. And this is a problem that is inherently linked to the history of President Roosevelt's decision in creating the Columbia Basin Irrigation Project. Now, if you have been to Grand Coulee Dam, you might have recognized the pipes that run from Lake Roosevelt, the water impounded behind the dam, uphill. Those pipes carry water for irrigation. In the 1940s, farmers who were in the area had the opportunity to vote whether or not to receive that federal water, that heavily subsidized federal water called project water. Most of the farmers, covering about 2/3 of the potential irrigation project, voted to accept the water and the conditions that went with it. About 1/3 of the farmers, about 1/3 of the area covered by the potential project, declined to accept the conditions of federal water. So in the succeeding 60 years, those farmers have continued to dryland wheat farm, and some have put down wells. Those wells have been pumping groundwater. Again, these are basalt aquifers in eastern Washington. They don't recharge. The water is fossil water, 10,000 to 20,000 years old. And not surprisingly, if you pump and mine these aquifers, the water tables drop. The problem of mining these aquifers in eastern Washington was recognized in the 1960s. In the 1970s, 1971, this was clearly recognized. The decision was put to the state. The recommendation from economists at Washington State University was that if you were going to go ahead and mine these aquifers, you only had about 30 years of water, and the farmers who were irrigating needed to amortize their investments over those decades and then transition out. Well, if you fast forward 30 years to the early 2000s, sure enough, the water tables are dropping dramatically, sometimes up to 10 feet per year. Farmers and others, business interests are now well organized and pushing and gaining political support for spending billions of dollars for a small group of landholders in eastern Washington to receive federal water that had been rejected in the 1940s. So the press is on. In December of 2010, the Bureau of Reclamation and the Washington Department of Ecology issued a draft proposal, and the public comment period closed in January of 2011, and we expect in 2012 the final proposal. This proposal will cost the public an extraordinary amount of money, probably $1 to $4 billion. It will benefit a handful of economic interests. It will likely damage shrub steppe habitat, which is already exists in only remnant areas and supports grouse and other species that are in jeopardy. And it will take more water out of the Columbia River and further threaten salmon. So despite these decades where we have witnessed such devastation to salmon runs in the Columbia River system by Grand Coulee and other dams, we are now witnessing a continued assault on the Columbia River and Columbia River flows by Washington State and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And that's today's program. Thank you for listening. And thank you for caring about water, about the land, and about the future of our communities.
It's a feeling that's flowing like a river. Time to swap them dollar signs for dreams. There's a river running through it and it flows through